He was too old to be running, around 50. His body had left its prime a long time ago, knees worn down. Lungs are more familiar with dust and sweat than with quiet air. But when the horns sounded across the field at Pharsalus, he did not stand still. He did not wait for the line to close ranks. He did not glance left or right to check his position. He ran straight forward. Ahead of him stood the enemy's center, a dense wall of shields locked together, bronze against bronze, wood pressed into wood. Behind them, spear points jutted out steady, unmoving, a formation designed to stop everything. Young men, strong men, men who were afraid. He did not slow down. There was no sign of panic, no hesitation, no attempt to evade. He ran as if the outcome had already been calculated, as if there was nothing left to adjust. When the distance collapsed, a gladius drove straight through his face. The blade entered through the mouth, shattered the jaw, pierced the neck, and burst out the back of the skull. Death was instantaneous. The nervous system never had time to react. The body collapsed after consciousness had already gone dark. He died before he hit the ground. The man's name was Gaius Crastinus. And the strangest part of this scene is not how he died, but why he was there at all. Crastinus had no business being at Pharsalus. He did not belong on that battlefield. Not by any legal definition. He had already been discharged, not recently, not in chaos, but after completing his military career in full. Crastinus had once held the rank of primus pilus, the highest centurion position a man of non-aristocratic birth could achieve in the Roman army. 20 years of fighting, 20 years of marching, 20 years of life inside the absolute order of the legion, and then like every soldier who completed his service, he was released. He had a pension, he had land, he had status. The Roman state no longer had any claim on his body. Legally, Crastinus was a free citizen, unbound under no obligation to lift a sword ever again. So why did he come back? And the more unsettling question is this: why did he not only return, but choose to run headlong into death at full speed? Just before the battle, Crastinus approached Julius Caesar, not to ask for orders, not to report. He did not salute. He spoke a single sentence preserved by history, not as a plea, but as a guarantee. Today, you will have reason to thank me, whether I am alive or dead. Then he turned away. Crastinus did not rejoin the main line. He gathered around 120 others and led them forward ahead of the formation. All of them are veterans, men who had once left the army, men who had returned to civilian life, and men who, for reasons that demand explanation, had voluntarily come back to war. They were not ordered to be there. No Roman law required them to return. They stood on that field because they had answered when they were called. Men like Crastinus were known as Evocati. The word comes from the Latin evocare, meaning to summon, but not by force. In the Roman military system, once a soldier completed his service and was discharged, the state lost all legal authority over his body. It could not command him. It could not compel him. To bring him back required only one thing: calling him by name and waiting for his answer. Evocati were the men who answered yes. They did not return as ordinary soldiers. They returned under special terms: higher pay, fewer obligations, an ambiguous status outside the normal rank structure. But none of this explains Crastinus's behavior. Money does not explain why a man who already possessed everything needed for a quiet life would choose to sprint into a wall of shields. Crastinus's death was not described as a tragedy even by his contemporaries. Caesar, upon seeing the body, noted that the wound was frontal, aggressive, not the wound of a man fleeing, but of one attacking. He awarded Crastinus a rare military honor usually reserved for high-ranking officers or aristocrats. It was a cold acknowledgement that the man had done exactly what he said he would do, and that creates a larger problem. Crastinus did not die for the Republic. He did not die for the law or for any abstract ideal. He died for a personal relationship, for a call he chose to answer. There was no obligation, no coercion, only choice. The moment a free veteran chose to return to war, the Roman army changed. When men like Crastinus entered battle, not because they had to, but because they wanted to, war ceased to be a civic duty. It became a transaction between individuals and power. And that is what makes Crastinus's death more disturbing than the blade that killed him. This was not a tragedy, it was a voluntary transaction. That morning was nothing special. There were no signal horns, no armor clashing, no orders shouted through the dust and blood. Just a field in the Italian countryside, the soil still damp from the night, and a man bent over a plow. He knew the rhythm of this work. Pull, step, blade tearing through earth. It was slow, steady, predictable. The kind of rhythm people call peace. That man had once worn armor. 20 years earlier, every morning had begun with metal, with commands with preparation to kill or be killed. Now mornings began with their dirt and sweat. The Roman state called this a reward, a plot of land, a quiet life, a proper return. Then came the sound of hooves, not the horse of a merchant or a neighbor. This animal was trained, its gait even, its tack tight. The rider carried no goods. He wore the tunic of a staff officer, clean, unhurried. He stopped at the edge of the field and waited. The veteran looked up. The rider did not read an order. He did not display a legal tablet. There were no threats, no mention of penalties or consequences. Instead, he handed over a sealed scroll, a familiar seal, a familiar name, a name this veteran had once shouted through smoke and chaos, a name that had once stood before the ranks and given the order to advance. This was not a summons, it was an invitation, and that distinction mattered. In the Roman army, everything was built on obligation. Obligation to the state, obligation to the republic, obligation to the law. A man was conscripted because he was a citizen. He fought because that was what citizenship required. But that obligation had a clearly defined limit. When a soldier completed his term of service and was discharged, the state lost its claim over his body. There were no emergency clauses, no exceptions. Legally, he was finished. So when war dragged on and commanders needed their best men back, they could not issue orders. They could not compel. They could not invoke the law. They could do only one thing: ask. The Latin word for this act was evocare, to call out, to summon, but not in the sense of state authority, in a personal sense. One man calling another, not because of rank, but because of relationship. The Evocati were the product of that mechanism. When the veteran unrolled the scroll, he was not reading a sentence. He was reading an acknowledgement. For 20 years, he had been a number on a roster, a name in a legion's records. Now the most powerful man in the war was calling him by that name. Not soldier, not citizen, but an individual. It was a subtle reversal and a dangerous one. In the traditional structure of the Roman Republic, the relationship between soldier and power was horizontal. Citizens served the state. The state protected its citizens. Loyalty flowed toward an abstract entity. The republic, the law, the collective, the Evocati call, shattered that structure. It created a vertical relationship. One man above calling, one man below answering. This was the old Roman patron-client model, injected directly into the army. The general became the patron. The veteran became the client. Loyalty no longer flowed toward the state, but toward the individual who had issued the call. And what made this bond stronger than any command was its voluntariness. No one forced the veteran to return. No one threatened him. When he stepped back into the ranks, it was his decision alone. That was precisely why it carried such weight. An order can be resented. An obligation can be fulfilled reluctantly. But a voluntary choice creates a different kind of binding force. It turns service into a personal commitment. When a man chooses to return to war, he cannot blame the law if everything goes wrong. He put himself there. For commanders like Caesar, this was an enormous advantage. An Augustus did not need to be threatened with punishment. He did not need to be reminded of civic duty. His loyalty was locked in the moment he answered the call. He did not fight for Rome. He fought for the man who had called his name, and for the veteran that call resolved a problem. The state never acknowledged the feeling of abandonment. After 20 years in a system where every decision was made for him, freedom was not always a reward. It was emptiness. The general's call filled that emptiness with a clear, familiar purpose. When the veteran folded the scroll, the decision had already been made long before it reached conscious thought. He knew he would go, not because the land was poor, not because the pay was better, but because someone still needed him. And in the only world he truly understood, being needed was the same as being alive. Rome did not fully grasp the consequences of this mechanism when it emerged. On paper, the Evocati were merely a practical solution, a way to reuse experience in a time of crisis. In reality, this was the moment the Roman army began to drift away from its civic foundation. Once loyalty became personal, it never returned to its original shape. Rome did not draft these men, it asked them. And from that moment on, everything began to change. Night fell slowly. Not the kind of night found in a military camp where fires still burned, where metal always clashed, where sentries changed shifts, where someone coughed in the darkness. This was the night of a farm. No signal horns, no armor, no one shouting up or form up. Only insects, wind moving through trees, and a silence so thick it felt almost physical. The man lay there, awake. He was not sleeping, not because of fear, but because he no longer needed sleep. His body was trained to wait. For 20 years, sleep had been fragmented, interrupted, stolen by sudden orders. Even when rest was permitted, the mind stayed alert, as if danger could arrive at any moment. Now, in his quiet house, there was no danger, and that was the problem. There was nothing to do. By day he worked the fields, repetitive labor, slow, predictable. No reflexes required. No life or death decisions. At night, no one needed him. No one depended on him to survive. There was no line to hold, no position to defend. He had completed his duty, and the world no longer demanded anything from him. But memory did not leave. In the dark, his mind recreated old sounds, the synchronized footsteps, the scrape of armor as an entire formation turned, the heavy breathing of 8 men packed into a single tent, the contubernum, the smallest unit of the Roman legion. 8 men who ate together, slept together, marched together, and if necessary, died together. For a soldier, these were not just comrades. They were family. 20 years inside a contubernum forged a bond that civilian life cannot replace. Every decision was collective, every danger shared. No one was ever truly alone. Even fear was communal. Now inside this house, the man had only himself, and that isolation exposed an uncomfortable truth. He did not know what to do with freedom. The Roman army did not simply train men to fight. It restructured how they understood the world. Life in the legion was binary, orders and action, enemy and ally, life and death. No gray zones, no ambiguity. Every day had a clear purpose, whether that purpose was marching, building a camp, or killing. The human mind likes that clarity. It likes reduction. It's like a world simplified to extremes. When a soldier was discharged, the state assumed the hard part was over. For many, it was only the beginning. Civilian life does not operate on binary logic. It is filled with compromise, contradiction, and problems without clean solutions. You must decide for yourself. You must bear responsibility alone. And there is no trumpet to tell you when to act. For some, this was freedom. For others, it was exile. There is no evidence that the ancient Romans understood what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder. They had no medical terminology, no therapy, but historical records show that they recognized the behaviors. Veterans who could not reintegrate, men who could not sleep, men are quick to anger, men who turned to drink violence or returned to war the moment the opportunity appeared. Not because they loved violence, but because violence was the only environment they fully understood. In the legion, everything had a place. Every man knew who he was. A centurion did not wonder where his value lay. His worth was measured by his ability to keep the line standing, whether others lived because of him. When he left the army, those measures vanished. In their place came abstractions, harvests, money, social standing, things with no final signal horn. And then the call arrived. Not a call from the state, but from a man who had once stood at the center of that old world. The call was not simply an invitation back to war. It was an invitation back to structure, a system where meaning did not need to be discovered because it had already been defined. Hold the line, obey orders, survive. For the veteran lying awake in the darkness, the choice was not as difficult as outsiders might think. To stay meant continued confrontation with silence, with the feeling of being surplus in his own life. To leave meant returning to a world of order, more dangerous but clearer. That is why men like Crastinus did not see the call as a sacrifice. They saw it as a release, not from death, but from a life they no longer recognized themselves within. The Roman state believed it had settled its debt with these men through land and money, but it ignored another debt, one that could not be measured in coin, the psychological dependency created by 20 years of continuous war. The Evocati were not the greediest soldiers. They were the least adaptable, and that was what made them dangerous. A young soldier fights for glory, for fear of punishment, or for recognition. A veteran returns to fight because war is the only place where he feels normal. When a society creates a class of men who function best in violence, peace becomes a problem. For most people, peace is the goal. For a few, it is unbearable. And those men, when given the chance to return to the battlefield, do not hesitate. Not because they hate civilian life, but because civilian life has no place for the person war turned them into. That is the core paradox of the Evocati. They were the Roman army's most successful product, perfectly trained, rigorously disciplined, shaped to fight and survive under the harshest conditions. But when the war ended, that same perfection made them incapable of returning as ordinary citizens. For men like these, peace was not a reward. It was exile. The afternoon in the camp moved along in a familiar rhythm. Thousands of men bent over digging ditches. Earth was split open and thrown aside. Wooden stakes were carried and raised and driven into the ground. This was not auxiliary work. This was the core of Roman discipline. Every evening, no matter how far they had marched, no matter whether there had been fighting that day or not, the camp had to be built like a fortress. That was how the army existed. That was how it survived. But not everyone was digging. At the edge of the camp near the fires, a group of men sat apart. They carried no shovels. They hauled no stakes. Their armor had already been removed. One man sharpened his sword. Another rolled a dice in his palm and let it fall into the dirt. They talked quietly. They laughed. No one hurried them back to work. No one gave orders. No one punished them. Everyone could see it. These were the Evocati. The distinction was not hidden. It was meant to be seen. In the Roman army, there was a word for this status immunes, exempt. Men who carried this designation were freed from daily labor. They did not dig ditches. They did not build camps. They did not stand night watch. The tasks that consumed 90% of a normal soldier's time no longer applied to them. In exchange, they were preserved for the one moment that justified their presence. They were paid more. Not slightly more, but double, triple, sometimes 4 times the pay of an ordinary soldier. The official explanation was experience. The real explanation was loyalty. Pay was not just compensation. It was a signal, a clear statement these men were not the same as the others. That difference extended to how they moved. While most of the legion marched on foot, under crushing loads, the Evocati were often permitted to ride horses or at least keep a pack animal for their personal gear. They did not carry the 60-pound sartina. They were not called Marius's mules. When the camp was finished, they still had strength left to fight. When others were exhausted, they remained fresh. Their equipment was different as well. A regular soldier was issued mass-produced armor, uniform, interchangeable. The Evocati often brought their own gear. old armor from earlier campaigns, reinforced over time, helmets purchased with private money, swords are sharpened to personal preference. Medals might hang from their cuirasses, relics of battles most of the men around them had never seen. In an army where uniformity was strength, they stood out as individuals. This produced an unavoidable consequence. A new class formed inside the army itself. In theory, the Roman legion was built on civic equality. Everyone dug the same ditches. Everyone marched the same distances. Everyone stood in the same line. The Evocati broke that principle. They stood outside the labor system, but not outside the power structure. Their presence created an informal hierarchy where experience and personal ties to commanders mattered more than official rank. That raised an uncomfortable question. What happens to discipline when not everyone carries the same burden? For recruits digging until their hands split open, the sight of Evocati sitting by the fire inevitably bred resentment. Older men working less, earning more, eating better, sleeping easier. In any other army, this would have been a recipe for collapse. But the Roman army held, not because resentment did not exist, but because it was crushed the moment the battle began. When the line formed and the enemy stood ahead, the difference became obvious. Men who had dug all day might feel their hands shake from exhaustion. The Evocati did not. They stepped forward with the calm of men who had been here too many times to be afraid. That confidence spread. It hardened points about to fail. It held the line for a few more minutes, and in war, a few minutes can decide everything. That was why commanders accepted the social cost of privilege. They understood that the Evocati were not just fighters. They were psychological instruments. Their presence reminded the rest of the army that there was another level of war, one only reached by those who had survived long enough. But privilege always cuts both ways. By separating the Evocati from shared labor commanders, also separated them from horizontal solidarity with ordinary soldiers. They no longer shared the same exhaustion, the same inconveniences. Gradually, they no longer shared the same world. Their loyalty, already personal, was reinforced by material difference. The Evocati did not need to argue for their value. That value was displayed daily by the fact that they did not dig ditches. This created a quiet form of power. No orders, no titles, just presence. In a camp built entirely on obedience, being exempt from the most basic rules was itself a statement. The Roman army turned privilege into a weapon. Not a weapon against the external enemy, but one used to shape behavior within. The Evocati were preserved for combat. In return, they became psychological anchors, invisible pillars holding formations together. But at the same time, they were living proof that this army no longer operated on civic equality. Once an army accepts that not everyone must dig the ditch, the next step is deciding who no longer has to obey which laws. The Evocati were exempt from labor. They were not exempt from power. The young man stood in the line with his hands trembling slightly. No one could really see it, but he could feel it. Sweat is pooling inside the shield. Shallow breaths. A heartbeat racing ahead of the horn's rhythm. In front of him, the enemy's shield wall advanced a moving mass of metal. This was the moment when everything could collapse. Not because the enemy was stronger, but because all it took was one man turning his back. Beside him, an older man stood perfectly still. He said nothing, offered no encouragement, gave no signal. He did not need to. Age showed clearly on his face. Old armor, scratches left uncovered. His posture was relaxed, as if this were nothing more than a familiar drill. The young man glanced sideways for a brief instant. That was enough. His breathing slowed. His hands steadied. The fear did not disappear, but it retreated far enough for him to remain in place. That was the effect of an evocatus. In ancient warfare, panic spread faster than any command. One man dropped his shield. The man behind him saw it. One step back became two. Then the line collapsed. No tactic could save a formation that was already running. Roman commanders understood this well, and they understood that discipline on paper was not enough to keep an army standing when every survival instinct screamed to flee. The Evocati solved this problem without speaking. They were distributed throughout the formation, not concentrated into a separate block, not to attack, but to stabilize. When a section of the line began to waver, the presence of a man who had survived dozens of battles was enough to slow the spread of panic, not because he was immortal, but because he no longer feared in the same way others did. That calm carried weight. It pulled the men around him back into reality. This was the psychological backbone of the army. Not orders shouted from the rear, not banners or slogans, but individuals who had proven through blood that they knew what would happen next and still stood there. In many battles of the civil wars, Evocati were not used as shock troops. They were used as an adhesive, placed at points of highest friction where the formation was most likely to break, to hold it together for a few more minutes. Those minutes were often enough, but this mechanism carried a deeper consequence. When a young soldier held the line because of the man standing beside him rather than the flag ahead of him, the structure of loyalty began to shift. Loyalty no longer flowed toward an abstract concept like Rome or the Republic. It flowed toward specific individuals, men he believed would not run, and those men were not loyal to the state. They were loyal to the general who had called them back. Evocati did not answer to the normal chain of command. They were not bound to their units in the traditional sense. Their connection was vertical, not horizontal. From them, directly upward to the supreme commander. Caesar understood this, and he exploited it deliberately. By placing Evocati at critical positions, he did not merely keep the formation intact. He embedded a network of personal loyalty throughout the army. When rumors spread through the camp, the Evocati heard them. When dissatisfaction began to simmer, the Evocati were there to suppress it, not through discipline, but through influence. A story about how the general had once saved them. A reminder that the other side was not as appealing as the rumors claimed. No reports, no punishments, just direction. Over time, the young soldier learned an unspoken lesson. When things went wrong, he did not look to the law. He looked to the man standing firm beside him, and that man looked to the general. A chain of loyalty formed without documents, without oaths. The army still carried Rome's banners. Shields still bore SPQR, but the meaning of those symbols had changed. They were no longer the center of loyalty. They were a shell. What truly held this army together was the web of personal relationships among men who had chosen war over peace. This was the moment the Roman army crossed an invisible line. From a force of citizens, it became the asset of individuals, powerful enough to attract and retain veterans. The state still paid wages. The state still issued symbols, but the state no longer controlled where loyalty flowed. An army like this could defeat any external enemy, but it also raised a question Rome wasn't prepared to answer. What happens when the men holding the line no longer believe the state represents them? The answer did not come immediately. It accumulated through each battle, each summons, each decision to trust a person rather than an institution. And when it finally surfaced, it was too late to reverse. The army still marched under Rome's banners. But it no longer belonged to Rome. They stood facing one another in silence. There were no shouts in foreign tongues, no barbarian dress, no enemy from the edge of the world. The shields were identical. The helmets were identical. The same familiar symbols etched into metal. If you ignored their positions, the two armies could have been one. Rome looking at Rome. In that moment, every story about the fatherland became meaningless. No one shouted that they were defending Rome. No one believed the men across the line were invaders. There were only orders. Advance. Hold the line. Kill the man in front of you. Civil war does not require hatred. It requires obedience. And this is where the Evocati became most dangerous. A young soldier could still hesitate. He might recognize a familiar voice across the line. Someone who had once shared a cooking pot, once dug ditches beside him years earlier. The civic instinct still existed. A single moment of hesitation was enough to break an assault. The Evocati did not have that moment, not because they were more cruel, but because they had lost the thing that caused hesitation. They no longer viewed war through the lens of community or civic duty. 20 years of service had worn down the idea of fellow citizen. To them, the battlefield had always demanded one thing: only survive by making the other man fall first. Experience in killing creates a form of functional numbness, not madness, but the ability to act without moral negotiation. The Evocati knew exactly where a thrust needed to land. They knew the sensation of steel meeting bone. They had crossed that shock long ago. When the enemy wore the same armor, it did not change the technique. In a civil war, that quality was decisive. Caesar understood this better than anyone. He did not rely on patriotism to defeat Roman opponents. He needed men who no longer asked why, only where. The Evocati were the answer. They did not need to be convinced that the enemy deserved to die. They only needed to be pointed in a direction. In the battles of the Civil War, the Evocati were often given the tasks no one else wanted: attacking the enemy's center where fighting was thickest, engaging the most elite units head-on, fully aware that the men opposite them were hardened Roman soldiers as well. This was not glorious warfare. It was the breaking of will. When an army watched its most seasoned troops pushed back by gray-haired men, advancing without hesitation, collapse came quickly, not because they were weaker, but because they recognized something terrifying: the men across from them were no longer restrained by the same moral limits. The Evocati became the perfect instrument for the kind of war Rome feared most, but could not avoid. They were no longer citizens bearing arms. They were weapons shaped like men, and weapons do not possess civic conscience. This is why decisive moments of the civil wars so often revolved around veteran units. When formations wavered, they did not retreat. When fighting dragged on for hours in mud and blood, they did not break. Not because they were braver, but because they were accustomed to having no alternative but forward movement. Caesar did not create the Evocati. The system existed before him, but he was the first to see their political potential. He did not use them only to win battles. He used them to reshape the nature of Roman war itself. From the conflict between communities, it became a clash between networks of personal loyalty. In that context, patriotism became a liability. It made men think. It made them compare. It slowed them down. The Evocati needed none of that. They had severed the last thread tying them to civilian life the moment they chose to return to war after freedom had been granted. And because of that, they killed more effectively than anyone else. Civil war is not won by ideals. It is won by men who can kill without needing to convince themselves they are right. Rome unintentionally created such men, then placed them in the hands of those ambitious enough to use them. When two Roman armies collided, history was not decided by who loved Rome more. It was decided by who was willing to leave Rome behind in their own mind. Patriotism is useless when the enemy wears the same uniform. Night settled over the camp on the banks of the Rhine like a heavy blanket. There were no trumpets, no call to assemble. Only the dim glow of dying charcoal fires and the steady breathing of thousands of soldiers sleeping after days of strain. In one corner of the camp inside the command tent, a list lay spread across a wooden table. It was not long. It did not need to be. Every name on it was carefully marked. This was not a roll of honor. It was a list of men to be removed. The men who received the list carried no standards. They wore no ceremonial armor. They carried only their swords. The Evocati left the tent in silence, splitting into small groups and dissolving into the darkness between the tightly packed rows of tents. None of them asked why. None of them needed to see the full picture. They needed to know only one thing: order was under threat, and they had been chosen to restore it. Blades were drawn inside the cramped space of sleeping tents. There were no arrests, no accusations read aloud. The soldiers whose names appeared on the list did not even wake up in time to understand what was happening. Tacitus describes the scene in language as cold as it is horrifying. No one knew the cause, only that there was blood. Groans were cut short in throats. Bodies were dragged outside, leaving dark streaks across the ground. This was the mutiny on the Rhine. And it was the moment the Evocati crossed the final line. The mutiny did not begin as an organized rebellion. It began as exhaustion. Soldiers who had served for decades saw no discharge in sight. Pay was delayed. Promises from Rome felt distant and hollow. Anger boiled over. Barracks were smashed. Officers were killed by their own men. A Roman army turned its weapons against the system that had created it. In that situation, the command could not rely on the army to suppress the army. Any public order risked open refusal. The traditional chain of command had collapsed, and when a system collapses, it requires a mechanism to correct itself. The Evocati became that mechanism. They were no longer aging heroes, standing firm in the line to steady morale. They became instruments of purge. For the first time in Roman history, the army cleansed itself from within, not through courts, not through the state, but through targeted violence. Those deemed a threat were not tried. They were eliminated. This fundamentally altered the nature of the Evocati. Once they were respected for their experience, now they were feared for their function. They no longer represented the army's glorious past. They represented its capacity for punishment. And once a group of men is granted the authority to kill its own comrades, to preserve order, it is no longer a body of soldiers in the traditional sense. By this point, the loyalty of the Evocati had moved far beyond any normal boundary. It was no longer tied to victory or defeat on the battlefield. It was tied to the survival of the system that had given them privilege and meaning. If that system collapsed, their role disappeared with it. So they defended it at any cost. Not all of them liked this role, but liking it was no longer relevant. They had stepped into a position from which there was no return. Once you have killed men in their sleep to preserve order, you cannot go back to being an ordinary soldier. You become what the system uses when every other measure has failed. What happened on the Rhine spread through the legions like a whisper. Everyone knew some men did not dig ditches, who did not stand watch, but who appeared when night fell and things went too far. The presence of the Evocati now carried a different meaning. It was no longer a reassurance. It was a warning. From that moment on, the Evocati were no longer simply a force of war. They became an instrument of governance through violence, an internal police of the army willing to do what no one else could or dared to do. The state did not need to intervene directly. The system corrected itself through them. This was the price of extreme professionalization. When a group is trained solely to maintain order through violence, it will eventually be used to suppress those who once stood beside them in the line. Hero and executioner cease to be opposites. They become phases of the same role. The Evocati had gone too far to turn back. They no longer fought for victory. They fought to keep the system running even as that system rotted from within. To the state, they were a solution. To ordinary soldiers, they were feared. And in the historical record, this is the moment the Evocati stopped being soldiers. They became the correction mechanism of a system that had begun to fear its own army. The body of Julius Caesar lay sprawled across the cold stone floor of the Senate. There were no shields raised, no ranks drawn up in formation. No man who had sworn to fight for him, living or dead. There was only blood soaking into his toga, the clumsy knife wounds of panicked senators, and an undeniable truth: the most powerful man in the world had died completely unprotected. The law had done exactly what it was designed to do. The law forbade soldiers from carrying weapons inside the sacred boundary of Rome. The law was meant to protect the Republic from generals who grew too powerful. The law assumed that power would restrain itself if it were placed inside a legal framework, and that obedience to the law is what killed Caesar, not because he lacked loyalty, but because the men most loyal to him were not allowed to stand at his side. Elsewhere, Octavian was watching. He was not in the Senate. He did not hold a dagger. He did not immediately call for vengeance. He looked at the body of his adopted uncle and reached a cold conclusion. Law does not protect power. It only protects those who do not hold it. The most important question after the Ides of March was not who killed Caesar. The real question was why it had been so easy, and more importantly, how to ensure it never happens again. Who stands between the knife and power when law no longer works? Octavian understood that the problem was not the Evocati. More precisely, the Evocati were not an aberration. They were the inevitable outcome of a military system so thoroughly professionalized that men could no longer return to civilian life. Trying to dissolve them would only create a dangerous vacuum, and that vacuum would be filled again, perhaps by men loyal to someone else. So Augustus did not abolish the Evocati. He put them on a leash. The Evocati Augusti were created as a structural decision, not a temporary solution. Re-enlisted veterans were no longer individuals summoned in moments of crisis. They became a permanent class, their fate bound to a single man, not the republic, not the legions, the emperor. The personalized loyalty that had once been a problem during the civil wars was now legalized as the foundation of the new order. The Praetorian Guard was the clearest expression of this shift. They were not stationed on distant frontiers. They lived at the center of power, closer to the emperor than any other force. Higher pay, shorter terms of service, explicit privileges. But most importantly, they did not belong to Rome in the old sense. They belonged to Augustus. Augustus did not need them to love the law. He needed them to understand that everything they possessed, money, status, safety, depended on one man remaining alive and in control. Loyalty was no longer a moral choice. It became a survival reflex. This created a form of stability Rome had never known. No more generals marching armies on the capital. No more free Evocati choosing sides. Violence was centralized, controlled, and positioned directly beside the throne. Power no longer negotiated. It was physically protected, but that perfection carried its own poison. When a group is granted a monopoly on protecting power, it quickly realizes that it does more than guard authority. It controls access to it. The Praetorian Guard began as a shield. Very quickly, it became a gatekeeper, and in many cases, it became the selector of emperors. Augustus understood this risk, but he accepted it. For him, a stable system that might become dangerous later was preferable to a republic that had already proven incapable of protecting itself. He chose the leash over trust. Control over moral assumption. The Evocati, once veterans who returned to war because they could not endure peace, now became an official component of the state. They were no longer an exception. They were a mechanism. That mechanism ensured that no Caesar would ever again die alone among men debating law. But it also ensured that Roman power would from that moment on live with a blade permanently positioned at its back. Augustus did not abolish the Evocati. He turned them into the empire's permanent leash. The coin rested in his palm, suspiciously light. Not light in size, but light in feeling. The veteran rolled it between his fingers, listening to the clink of metal, a sound that had once represented Rome's promise. Pay was delivered on time. Land at discharge, a quiet life after war. But now the coin could no longer buy what it once did. It could not buy grain. It could not buy land. It could not buy trust. The letters were still sent. The seals were still intact. The summons still used the old words, the words that had once carried almost sacred weight. But this time the recipient did not rise at once. He folded the letter, set it on the table, and returned to his work, not because he had found peace, but because the promise no longer meant anything. No elite unit dies because it loses its first battle. It dies when the reason to fight stops being convincing. For centuries, the Evocati existed because of an unspoken bargain. They provided experience, functional detachment, and the ability to enforce order through violence. In return, the state paid generously, not only in money, but in status privilege and a clearly defined place within the structure of power. When one side of that bargain collapsed, everything else followed with alarming speed. The crisis did not begin with swords, but with economics. The denarius, once the standard of the Mediterranean world, was slowly hollowed out. Silver was replaced with copper. Copper was thinly plated with silver. Each new emperor needed money to pay the army, and the fastest solution was to mint more coins. Inflation eroded every old promise. Nominal wages rose, but real value collapsed even faster. And Evocati promised double the pay of an ordinary soldier, but still received double the pay of something nearly worthless. Loyalty can survive violence. It can survive endless war, but it cannot survive economic meaninglessness. When reward no longer matched, risk behavior changed. Veterans who had once returned to war because they could not endure the emptiness of civilian life now faced a different calculation. Return for what, if war is no longer guaranteed a better position in the system? If privilege existed only on paper? Alongside the collapse of currency came the disintegration of military culture. Rome no longer had enough citizens willing to serve for decades. The legions were increasingly filled with foederati warriors drawn from outside the empire. They were strong, battle-hardened, but they did not share the collective memory of the Roman army. They had not grown up with stories of the Republic of civic honor or of gray-haired Evocati holding the line. Their loyalty belonged to their chieftains, their tribes, and immediate reward. In that environment, the Evocati lost their intermediary role. Their influence depended on shared culture and accumulated respect. When that cultural foundation disappeared, the words of a Roman veteran carried little weight with a Germanic warrior who did not speak the same language or recognize the same values. The network of loyalty that had once held the army together was cut strand by strand. Violence remained, experience remained, but the operating system was gone. The Evocati were gradually pushed away from the center of power. Some became administrators, supply officers, or trainers of new recruits. The title survived, but its substance was hollowed out. They were no longer decisive tools of war or politics. They became an administrative label inside an overstretched machine. There was no final battle of the Evocati, no heroic last stand. They were not destroyed by an external enemy. They were made unnecessary. When money could no longer purchase loyalty, when shared culture dissolved, professional violence lost its strategic value. Rome did not fall because it lacked swords. It fell because it no longer had reasons strong enough for its best men to carry them. The summons letters continued to be sent for a time, but fewer and fewer were answered. Not because men had become better citizens, but because the system that once gave them meaning could no longer keep its word. Loyalty does not die in a revolution. It dies quietly when the unit of currency collapses, and with it, every promise stamped into metal. Ideology can survive military defeat, but loyalty collapses faster than any belief system when the currency dies. The soldier sat alone in a quiet room. There was no smell of gun oil, no engine noise. On the wall hung a few old photographs, faces that had once stood side by side in places no one wanted to remember. The phone vibrated. Not a message from family, not a notice from the state, an unfamiliar number, a brief call. Then a file arrived, a contract, clear terms, defined duration, specific pay, no flag, no ideals, just clauses and a signature line. The soldier did not answer immediately. He stared at the screen for a long time, not because he needed to decide whether he loved his country, but because he was weighing an old question, one so familiar it hurt. Did he really belong in this quiet world? Did the Evocati truly disappear? Or did they simply change names, uniforms, languages, while their nature remained intact? History likes to end stories with collapse. Rome fell. The legions dissolved. Titles vanished from administrative records. But people do not disappear with institutions. The types of men Rome created did not crumble with arena stone. They stepped out of ancient history and into a new context. Today, we call them by different names: private military contractors, security advisors, strategic protection units, neutral sanitized terms stripped of the smell of blood. But when you look closely at their behavior, their motivations, and their position within structures of power, the familiarity becomes uncomfortable. They are men who have completed their service to the state. They possess skills that civilian society does not need or does not know how to use. They struggle to return to ordinary rhythms of life. And when the system calls them back, not with orders, but with contracts, they answer. Like the Evocati, they are not forced. They are invited. War in the modern world no longer always takes the form of mass mobilization. It is increasingly selective, fragmented, and unofficial. States still exist, but violence is increasingly outsourced. Tasks that are politically inconvenient for regular armies are handed to units operating outside public scrutiny. No flag, no oath, no visible accountability. Loyalty in this environment becomes a commodity. It has a price, terms, an expiration date, and when the contract ends, loyalty can be renewed, transferred, or terminated without betraying any ideal, because ideals were never central to begin with. The similarity does not lie in weapons or tactics. It lies in the psychological structure. These men do not seek war because they love violence. They seek it because it is the only environment where their skills make sense, where their experience is properly valued, and where the internal silence briefly disappears. Like the Evocati, they exist in a gray zone between state and market. They are not fully soldiers. They are not fully civilians. And it is precisely this gray zone that makes them both useful and dangerous. Roman history shows us what happens when violence is personalized, when loyalty is purchased, and when men shaped by war can no longer find a place in peace. At first, the system uses them to stabilize itself. Then it depends on them, and eventually it loses the ability to control them. Not every modern contractor is a new Evocatus. This comparison is not meant to equate, but to identify a recurring pattern. When war becomes a service, when experience in killing becomes an asset, and when society does not know what to do with people who have learned to live inside violence, history does not repeat itself, but it plants the same seed. The soldier looked back at his phone. The contract was still there. No pressure, no threats. The choice was entirely voluntary. And that was what made it frightening. Voluntarism was the foundation of the Evocati. It made them more effective than any conscripted force, and it made them harder to control than any other. Rome fell. The legions vanished. Ancient titles became footnotes in history books. But the type of man who is summoned did not disappear. He emerges whenever a society creates war and does not know what to do with the people who learned how to live inside it. The summoned men always exist. The world simply keeps finding new names for them.